Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to meet you, learn more about Carolina grounds. We just kicked it off finding out how our worlds have intertwined up until now. So let's start the conversation so our guests get to learn more about you and what you're up to.
Super. Well, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So can you just, for those not familiar with you and Carolina grounds, tell us a little bit about what Carolina grounds is?
Yes, be happy to. Carolina Ground is a small flour mill, flour as in bakers.
Mhm.
We launched to connect the farmer, miller, and baker here in the South. So basically, we buy grain from um, large scale organic growers here in the Carolinas or surrounding southern states, but predominantly North Carolina. And we stone grind the flour. So it's a really high quality flour. And we do both whole grain and sifted, and we sell it to bakeries throughout the Southeast. And we sell the flour also to home bakers nationwide through our online store.
Wow, that's great. So can you tell me what drew you to this field?
Drew me to this field. I started baking when I was in college. Um, I was a history major, and I was really taken by the moment in history, the Industrial Revolution, the reaction to what was happening. I was, I was, it was a time in history where I felt like there was this polarity. There was the reaction in from artists and writers to what was happening in this change in society. And I was really intrigued by it. And it really drew me to an interest in doing something tactile, to learning how to bake bread. I wanted to learn how to garden. I just was pushed in a direction by something I learned as a history major. And so I grew up in Miami, which was very disconnected from during the era that I grew up. It was very disconnected from these tactile um, activities. Although
Hmm.
my mom had beard on bread, which is a classic, and I mean, I was I started baking just as a secondary activity while I was making, writing papers for school. And I was fascinated by the process.
And so you graduated from college. You had been doing this while you were in there because you were inspired, which that's what college is supposed to do, right? Inspire
Right.
us. I mean, so it seemed like you're on the right track. And why did you build this business? Like, why did you get into bread in particular? What were you hopeful for achieving?
Right. Well, there was this this thing for me when I was baking, and I saw bread baking as a way back, as a mark in history, that this was one activity that still exists, that had existed so many years before. And I was very intrigued by the fact that my leavening, these yeast packets said rapid rise, like what came before. It was obviously a reaction to something else. And so I started digging, and I found my way. And this was, this was in the very early 90s.
So how is this? So let's go back a minute. So you did this right out of college, is that correct? Because you had started in college and you
Yeah.
apprenticeships. Sorry, it was a
Yeah.
bit of a tongue twister. And then you kicked off your own business.
Yes.
So that's your first time being an entrepreneur. And so what was that experience like for you? Because you
Right.
came out of college, you did these apprenticeships, but it wasn't like you'd worked in business before or you had built a business. So that's got to be a little scary and with lots of unknowns.
Well, baking is very methodical. So there were certain things that kept me very tethered to um, a schedule that, I mean, I sort of mirrored the schedules that I had been experiencing in these businesses that I was working in, my two apprenticeships. But I also, along the way, had um, gotten married, had a baby, gotten a divorce. All of these things happened within those first few years. And through all of that, the bakery was like the one very clear the culture needed to be fed, the flour needed to be milled, the oven needed to be fired. And this was not a bread that I had to convince people to eat. It was so um it it was a unique product
So
in a
talk to
world.
me about that. Tell me, how is it unique? If I was to taste yours and taste another one, what would the experience be like for me?
Right. Well, now, I mean, it's so exciting. Everyone knows what sourdough is now. Back then, sourdough was San Francisco sourdough or Alaskan style, and it really just denoted like this sourness that was a microbial that was also the bread itself was leavened with a pinch of yeast. But this was like natural leavening that was a different process, and the flavor profile was not driven by sour. It was a more of a balance, but it was also, when you're working with grain in this way, it's a way more nutritious product. There's a level of, so I could talk to somebody about, this is the quality of, pre-fermentation, or this is the, the health benefits of, or they could just taste it because it has um a much greater depth of flavor um and complexity and mouthfeel.
This has been a long journey for you. Like I feel like it was part of that moment that you had in college, and that it sort of led you to where you are. You now have this bakery, and it seemed like it was as methodical to create the bread as it was to build the business for you, which I think is amazing because it's not like that for everyone, right? Sometimes it's like you're trying to figure it all out, but for you, it seemed like it was really methodical and it just made sense. So would that be a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. And eventually I found myself as a single mom, and it's interesting because it was like the perfect thing to do as a single mom. Really, the bakery was next to my house. It had a certain rhythm that parenting has as well. So it was this really lovely balance in a way. I mean, at its best days was this balance between raising my daughter and raising my bakery. And I would say raising my bakery because there weren't really other examples. There's very few of us in the country at that time doing these sort of cottage bakeries. Back then it was wood fired oven. These days people use these ovens called there's like, people have gotten into the design of these sort of cottage bakery ovens. That Rothko is one brand, but back then it was the wood fired brick oven. But regardless, as a mother of a 29-year-old now, I can say, yeah, I really was lucky because even though I was on the path to law school, and I threw that aside when I ran down this passionate pathway of, reviving an art form. I felt like I was this like activist, that I was like doing this service by bringing, and, this is what we think when we're in our 20s. It's great.
So
Yay.
now 30, 25, 30 years later, you have this mill and you create this bread. How do you see it as compared to others that are now in the space? Because it's a bit more of a saturated space. It's a little bit, there's a lot more going on in it versus when you really kicked it off initially.
Well, right. And I'm no longer running a bakery. I now run a flour mill.
Right.
So, and which was really interesting because when I was running a bakery, I watched the baking sphere, like so many more bakeries came online as I was, I eventually moved my bakery to West North Carolina. I started in Tennessee, and by the early 2000s, you could really see the artisan baking movement taking off, which was so exciting. Bakers love bakers. We get along really well. It's a very collaborative, generous community. And which is really what enabled Carolina Ground to get launched, because by 2008, we were a very cohesive community, and we all experienced this crisis together. So we pulled our chairs together and we're like, hey, let's, is this possible? Because I had this idea, and I was amazed that everyone followed my lead, because I was definitely the most fringe baker. I was doing it the hardest you possibly could do it with the wood. The other bakeries were like not as extreme as I was. I was like, leading this very austere bakery, my, cottage bakery. But another thing that happened in 2008 was people that were graduating college then were entering a workforce that didn't exist, like a, a career path that was dissolving. I mean, there were so many people that expected one career and then were like graduating into, and into a completely flat, for a moment there. But what that really created was this new population of makers, be it bread bakers, potters, pastry chefs. I mean, it was really an interesting time. And so Carolina Ground also benefited from this like new population of bakers. And then the next, the next crisis was the pandemic. So it's been a really interesting thing that these moments in history where, I started at a place where I was looking back thinking, what did we lose when we experienced what we always would call progress? What was the loss in that move towards speed and efficiency?
No, I was going to say, so as you continue to evolve, right?
Yeah.
What is the most revolutionary part of what you're doing?
Well, okay. In my mind, it's this desire to stay small. I don't want to be a huge, any improvements we make at Carolina Ground are for efficiency and quality. I really don't want to be a huge manufacturing plant. And what we mill in a year, a small industrial mill probably does in a day. And
Wow.
we process a couple, 2 to 3,000 pounds a day here. So we're not for nothing, we
Right.
sell flour to bakeries all over the Southeast. But I just want to stay a certain size. And I really am more interested in lateral growth and community outreach. So we do workshops and pop-up events. And um, I want the experience to be something that drives quality of life, not just driven by numbers.
How do you see that impacting the future of this
Oh,
space?
do you mean the movement of regional mills?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we all rise to the top if we're collaborative, and it's easier to be collaborative if I'm not just being driven by continuously building our numbers every year, looking back of like, oh, have we increased by 20% this year, 25%? Did we go down a point? I just am I'd love to crack the code of like how small can you be and still be sustainable? And by sustainable, I mean like fiscally on all levels, what is the balance? And it's tricky. I mean, farmers grow a field of grain and they just want to sell all of that grain, and bakers just want a specific amount of flour. And the miller is sort of like that person in between, not only, the grain itself. I mean, that's like a whole other complexity of, what was the weather doing 2 months ago? What was the weather doing 6 weeks ago? When did you plant this? I mean, there's just getting a good crop out. And then what happens on a year where everybody has a great crop and you have too much grain, or a year where nobody has a great crop and you don't have enough grain. It's not simple, but it's, I think one of the things that really keeps all of us going is that collaborative spirit, because I can call my friends up in Western New York and, how's harvest going? And we all kind of care about each other. My friends in California or in the Midwest, or, here in North Carolina, other friends who are doing something similar.
So I think that it sounds like such a nice, tight community that's very supportive, collaborative, and shares very similar values. So I think that, I mean, that sounds amazing to be part of also. And it feels like it feeds itself in many ways, right? Being part of that feeds the growth of that, and hopefully will, share that sentiment across the board so other people maybe can get on board with it, because I think it's so much more fun, it's so much more powerful, it's so much more impactful when we can do it together,
For sure. Yeah.
right? So, what is the most, I know we're wrapping up here, and I want to think about those founders that are listening. Is there one or two things that you might share with somebody if they want to take control of their business or take a leap of faith and, be in another regional mill, or something that you've learned that you think they could benefit from?
Huh. Um, wow. It's really, 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 really hard. That's what somebody told me when I started my mill. I reached out to a miller that was a reputable miller out in Kansas, and he said, "You're about to set out on like the most difficult agricultural endeavor." And it was a fair warning, which, I mean, it is really, you're asking me this during harvest. It's a really hard thing to pull off and I can't even begin to tell you, but I will say it's amazing when, okay, we get through it. We've got grain. We're doing it. It's amazing. Look at this flour. This is great. Look at this bread. Look at this pastry that tastes so good because we are milling it with, we're holding on to the germ oils, which carry all the flavor and nutrients. We're not just like making this baked good that is just sugar and egg. It actually has this like really interesting, complex, flavor forward flour that's like informing this tart or whatever it is. I mean, it's the this isn't good. This isn't a piece of advice. I'm just telling you that that's the reward of it. But I mean, it is not for the faint of heart. If you're just like, ooh, this looks like a good way to make money, then you are definitely not on the right, like not saying the right things.
So for those folks that are interested in tasting your flour, using your flour, how might they get in contact with you, or how might they
Right.
go about getting that?
carolinaground.com is our website.
Okay, awesome. And if they just wanted to learn more about your journey, maybe connect, what would be the best way to connect with you for that?
Right. I did write a book called Southern Ground. 10 Speed Press is my publisher. And a third of the book is narrative, so there's a lot of story. And 2/3 of it are recipes. And I did that so that I really wanted to offer the tools for folks to be able to utilize, there's a lot of fear between going from like the store-bought flour to flour like ours. And the recipes are drawn from I've curated them from bakeries we work with throughout the Southeast. So they're just like an amazing collection of, and some of them are my own as well, but it's an amazing collection of recipes. But there's also a ton of story. I interviewed all these bakers and I also told my own story and really tried to tell the story of what this looks like, from the farmer, miller, and baker. So
Awesome.
anyway.
I hope that the community, whether it's the founders or other people in the space, check out your book. We'll make sure to have a link in the show notes, as well as a link to you so that they can learn more about what you're doing, and Carolina Ground. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Love learning about your journey and how you came to do it. It's really nice to hear from somebody that was able to follow their passion and create a business and a life for themselves, because I know that is often a challenge for so many.
Thank you so much, Justine.
Thank you.